Hello and welcome to another Hobby Essentials video. Today, airbrushing. We're going to be talking about how to thin your paints for an airbrush. Now the main paints I'm going to be using for this are going to be, again, Games Workshop's Citadel paints. Got myself a layer paint and a base paint. The two most common paints that you'll actually try and run through an airbrush. I've also got some of the Citadel air paints, which I do actually use and I do recommend these if you're airbrushing. And I've also got some Vallejo Game Color ink. I'm using a Hardware Steenbeck Evolution here. It's a 0.4mm nozzle with a 0.4mm needle. That's about the best size that you want for using acrylics, and the reason for that is that acrylics dry very quickly. Compared to most other paints that you might run through an airbrush, such as enamels, acrylics dry very, very fast, which is one of the things that makes them really good for brush painting. For airbrushing, it's a bit of a problem. Now, this is a dual action gravity feed airbrush. It's got a trigger here, it's got a well here, which you can put bigger ones on, but I usually use this one. And down in there, which you can just about see, we've got our needle, and in the end here, let's take the cap off, you can see that when we pull back on the trigger, the needle retracts. As it retracts, it allows paint to leave the nozzle and join the airstream. Generally speaking, I run my air compressor at 30 psi and I don't tend to change it, and that's because rather than change my air pressure, I just control the amount of paint that I allow into the airstream. Now if I'm going to be airbrushing something very close, then I will drop my air pressure down because the air itself could knock the model away. It could also cause the paint to move around. But generally speaking, I'm airbrushing from about 6 inches away, because I don't tend to use my airbrush for detail work. And for that, I'll mostly just control how much paint I'm using with this. So 30 psi is a good starting point for a 0.4mm-ish airbrush. If you've got a smaller nozzle, you'll need to jack the air pressure up usually to get the same kind of flow rate. If you've got a bigger nozzle, you can drop it down again. So the smaller the nozzle, the more pressure you'll need in order to get the paint through. And this is because acrylic paints have usually got quite thick, fast-drying pigment, which will clog your tip if you don't have enough pressure to actually get it through before it dries. The other situation is thicker paints, such as surface primers. I sometimes increase my air pressure up to 40 psi just so that it flows through a bit easier. And for things like inks, I'll usually drop the air pressure down to about 20 psi because these are so thin that they do not need the additional pressure to help them move through. Now, before we begin, 99% of problems with an airbrush can be attributed to it not being clean. If the insides of your airbrush are not clean, or if there's a paint clog somewhere, you're going to get problems. You might not be able to get your paint through the airbrush. It might cause any number of problems with your spray patterns. Before you do anything, inspect your airbrush, make sure it's nice and clean. If it's not, go and clean it. I covered all of this in my Hobby Essentials airbrushing video, so there should be a thing up there for where you can go see that. And I've given this a nice deep clean just for this tutorial so you can make sure that it's all working well. Now, why does paint clog in your airbrush? This is probably the main reason why you're watching this video. Why is my airbrush clogging all the time? And that is because the paint is drying before it's actually left the airbrush itself. So, as you've got air passing over this needle, like so, that air is actually causing the paint to dry. It's causing the water to evaporate and disappear from the paint. And you're essentially ending up with just pigment suspended in air. Pigment and medium. Now you don't want this paint to dry until it's hit the model. But if you don't thin your paint enough, or if you don't have a drying retarder in there, for example, then your paint will dry on the tip. So on the actual tip here. Now, in order to clear tip dry, before it happens to all of us eventually, usually most painters just take the tip protector off and just use our fingernails and just kind of pull. So just to get the paint off the tip. And that's usually sufficient to clear a small clog, as long as you catch it really quickly. If you leave it like that, then every time you pull the needle back in, that dried paint is going to accumulate inside of the nozzle. And when it comes out, there might not be as much paint on the tip, but that's because the dried paint is now inside the nozzle, which is going to make a clog or blockage much more likely every single time you start running paint through it. If it seems like your airbrush is starting to clog, then you need to take the cap off, check the tip, and make sure that there's no paint on it. Now, you can avoid tip dry by adding drying retarders or just thinning your paint better. So, there's a lot of brands out there, for example, the old Vallejo Model Air range, who say that you can put their paint straight through an airbrush. It's not really true, especially not with the desaturated colours. The bright ones, a little bit, but the desaturated colours dry so quickly that even thinned down, they have a tendency to do a lot of tip dry. And so you still want to thin these down a little bit. Not quite as much as you'll need to thin a Games Workshop base paint, for example. But you'll need to add a bit of thinner in order to make sure that they do not clog. Now, I'm going to start off by demonstrating essentially the spray pattern that you want to look for, and I'm going to do that by using some ink. Now, ink should need no thinning at all to go through an airbrush. Indeed, it's pretty much what airbrushes were designed to use to begin with. I'll just put a few drops there in my cup. And this is just Vallejo Game Colour Green. Nothing particularly special about this. So I've got some green ink in here. I'm just going to demonstrate what your spray pattern should look like. Now, this is very important for trigger control. In fact, I'm going to zoom out a little bit so that you can see what I'm doing. In fact, that's as far as I can zoom out. So, air. And then gradually pull back on the trigger so that you've got paint. That's what you're looking for. Now, ink, generally speaking, I'd want to drop my PSI down to about 20. I'm still running at 30. You can see here, it's just started to pool a little bit because it's a bit too much paint and it's not drying straight away. In fact, it should be dry now. Yeah, it's dry now. So that's what it looks like when your paint is going on correctly. You'll notice this is quite a translucent layer. Inks are relatively translucent when going through an airbrush. But generally speaking, just like with painting with a regular brush, you want to use multiple thin coats of translucent paint in order to build up your colour rather than one thick coat. Your paint will go on smoother, you'll get less spattering, your spray pattern will be more accurate, and it'll be less noticeable that you've airbrushed your model. So second coat. Again, starting with air, then adding paint in, and the colour builds up to a much more intense green. Now, I'm not sure if you can see this. I'll zoom in as much as I can. But even with this ink, this acrylic ink, I still have some drying on the tip of my airbrush. Now, this isn't very much. This is a completely negligible amount, to be honest. But this will always happen. You'll always get a little bit of tip dry from everything. And you just want to clean it off whenever you notice it. Like so. Now I'm going to move straight on to the other end of the spectrum. I'm going to use a Games Workshop base paint. And I'm going to put this in unthinned to start with, which I may regret, because it might result in me having to clean my airbrush quite significantly. But we'll give it a try and see what happens. So, as you can see, this is quite thick stuff. Let's get a paintbrush load and a or two. Put it in the cup there, and I've not thinned this at all. I'm running at 30 psi still. I'm going to see what happens. So, that's just some ink that's still in the reservoir. Anything, I'm pulling all the way back. Well, that's pretty... Yep, nothing. Not a single bit of paint came out. All that came out was some ink that was left in the tip. But this is the same thing I use when I'm thinning my paints for a paintbrush. This is 20 parts water to 1 part Winsor & Newton Galleria Flow Improver. They've got a different version which you can get from the Amazon affiliate link in the description, which is their professional version. The main difference with that is that it's 10 parts water to 1 part Flow Improver, and it comes in a slightly different bottle. This stuff's, for some reason, really hard to get hold of. However, 1 bottle will last you a really long time when airbrushing on miniatures. So, I've got about 2 brushfuls worth of Games Workshop base paint in there. I'm going to add 1, 2, 3, 4 drops worth of my thinner and swill it round with an old brush. And you should be able to see, as I wipe the brush off at the top there, that it's moving much more freely, flowing down the side of the cup. And that's good. We want it to be nice and thin like that. So now, the paint is coming through. Again, I'm not pulling back on the trigger very much. And I'm also not getting much tip dry as well. I've slightly over-thinned it a little bit because it's still, and that's not me, that's just air, it's still very wet. So this is a Games Workshop base paint, and I've over-thinned it. Or rather, I've applied too many layers of it. So it will still work. Again, the thinner the better, but you will have to do this, essentially. So there's our first thin layer, and we're just going to use some air from the airbrush to help dry that off. And we're going to apply a second thin layer. Use some air to dry it off, and then a third thin layer. And again, use the air to dry off. As you can see, it's still patchy, so I'm just going to apply a bit more. And like I said, doing it this way with the multiple thin layers is the best way to build up a smooth coat of paint, because you don't end up with large lumps of pigment hitting the model, drying, and then being bumpy. You also don't end up getting things like dust or hairs trapped underneath the paint. And you don't end up with a lot of spattering. My spray pattern is actually quite neat here, with very little what's known as dithering towards the edges. Now, because this is one thing that is actually true of all airbrushes, it doesn't matter what you're putting through them, the pattern will be a bit speckledy as you zoom in on it. For the most part, to the human eye, you can't really notice it, especially not at tabletop distance. But for example, in close-up pictures or under a head magnifier, you might notice the spattering pattern of the airbrush if your paint has been applied too thickly. Very easy. Again, pretty much just water. The Flow Improver in this instance mostly helps with the drying time, but I find it reduces the tip dry significantly. I think that's because this acts as a bit of a drying retarder. You could also use Liquitex Slow Dry, although you wouldn't need anywhere near as much of it. Vallejo's Airbrush Flow Improver is also basically just a drying retarder that prevents tip dry. Now you'll note, if we zoom in, that I don't have much paint dry on my tip at all, and that's why my paintbrush is not clogging. Now I'm going to show you what happens if your paint is too thick. So here, same Castellan green, I just not added anywhere near as much water, because if you remember, just straight out of the pot, it wouldn't go through the airbrush at all. Instead, I've only added 1 drop of water to 4 brush loads of paint. It's passing through the airbrush a little bit, but it's not going clear. Now you may be tempted to do this if you want to cover in 1 coat, let's say. Something that is very tempting early on. And it will work if that's the only colour you want to put down. And it will still be smoother than if you base coated by a brush using unthinned paint, basically. But it's still undesirable, especially if you're trying to do smooth blends between colours. So, I will show you what happens. Now here I am. Some paint is coming through, but it's not really enough, So I'm pulling quite far back on the trigger until the paint is now coming through, and you can see it's clogging. This isn't good. I'm having to kind of rock the thing back and forth, the trigger back and forth, to clear blockages. And if we look, here, we've got some significant tip dry occurring. So let's clean that off. And I'm actually having to pull the trigger all the way back, which is blowing through all of my paint really quickly. That was 4 brush loads of paint. It didn't cover as much as it should have done, because it was having difficulty passing through the airbrush. And you can see we have over here what's known as spattering. This is where paint has dried on the tip and then been blown off the tip onto our painted surface. And this forms these big clumps, which are very easily noticeable. Now, if you're trying to perform a smooth blend from, say, zenithal highlight, this transition will be really, really obvious, and it'll give it that kind of classically airbrushed look that you sometimes see. This means that your paint is too thick. And if you thin your paint down, probably just a couple more drops of water will do it. Your paint will go on much smoother, it will go on much more translucent, and you'll be able to get a much smoother blend as a result. If you ever see this kind of spattering, it means your paint is too thick. It could also mean that your PSI is too low for the consistency of paint you have, but in my experience, it's better to thin your paint than it is to change your PSI. The only exception to that is if you're using surface primer, in which case, just increase your PSI. It's not a great idea to thin down your surface primer if you can help it. The other significant downside of not thinning your airbrush paint properly is that it makes your airbrush much harder to clean. If you've got thin paint in here, then when it comes time to clean it, it's very easy to clean. If your paint is too thick, it's actually very difficult to keep clean. Not only does it result in more clogging and blockages, it also takes up much more of your time between changing paints, because it's just going to take much longer to clean your airbrush between colours. So if you keep your paints nice and thin, it speeds this process up a lot. This is going to take me like 10 minutes to clean out. Okay, so next I'm going to show you the difference with thinning down Citadel layer paints. So this is Ogden Camo, which is a layer paint. Giving it a good shake. Always give your paints a good shake. And I'm actually going to apply the thinner first. I'm just going to apply 1-2 drops. Should be enough for my purposes. And get a brush full. And a little bit more. And you can see the consistency is actually not that different to the base paint. And that's because the base paints from the Citadel range, they've got more opaque pigments, but their consistency doesn't often change that much from the layer paints. The layer paints are just more translucent pigments, so they don't cover as well. So you'll actually need about the same amount of thinner as you would for the base paints. But again, every paint pot is different, and you aren't always going to be able to tell. So that looks pretty good. Okay, and ooh, that was some water that was stuck in the thing. Right, and here we go. Now, as you can see, the layer paints actually go through a little bit nicer. This is thinned to roughly the same consistency as the previous base colour, but because it's a more transparent pigment, it's not covering as well. This means that you'll need more layers to get an opaque coat, but at the same time it means that creating gradient blends with it will actually be easier. Again, using the air from the airbrush just to dry everything off. And then we have an opaque layer of Ogren camo. Now, again, no tip dry when you actually thin your paints properly. And have a little bit of drying retarder in there. So, layer paints and base paints. Basically, if it's Citadel, it's probably going to be about the same. You just need to make sure that the paint consistency will run down the side quite easily off your brush. And if it does that, then it should run smooth through your airbrush. Citadel air paints work very well straight out of the bottle, strange enough. Well, I transferred this from the pot that came into one of these dropper bottles, but I haven't diluted this or added anything to it. Now, these work quite well in the bottle, but you do need to use a very light touch with them because they have a tendency not to dry very quickly, and I think that's because they've added some drying retarder to them. So if you added any extra drying retarder to these, it will take ages to dry, and you don't want to do that. So with the Citadel air paints, you actually don't want to thin them down at all. Now the trick with the Citadel air paints is to do them in very, very thin coats using very, very minute trigger control in order to make sure it doesn't pool, so that the paint actually has enough time to dry on the surface before you apply the next layer. Because if you do it the way you would normally do it with their other paints, which don't have much drying retarder in them, then it spiders really quickly. On the other hand, the colours in the Citadel air range are very vibrant, and the fact that they don't need any additional thinning works really quite well in their favour. So as you can see here, I've got a nice opaque coat of my Elysian green there. And that isn't fully dry yet. In fact, I'll see if I can catch the reflection off it. So you can see there, it's still very, very wet. And if I was to get my airbrush too close to that, the paint would move around again. So the trick with the Citadel air paints is to make sure you do them in very thin coats. Let each coat dry before applying the next one and build it up. But what this does mean is because they're usually such translucent paints, you'll get a very, very smooth gradient with the Citadel air paints compared to just thinning their regular layer or base paints, or even using Vallejo model air paints straight out of the pot. You can of course use a hairdryer to dry it faster, just don't get it too close or on too high a setting. Now, the last thing I'll mention is Vallejo model air paints. Now, these are also billed as being able to use straight out of the bottle, but personally I find that they need a little bit of thinning in order to go on smooth. Technically they will go through an airbrush straight out of the bottle, but the spatter is quite high. You get a very dithered effect. The translucency is okay, but also they have a tendency to dry on the tip of the airbrush. And you can get some clogging. So I'm getting some clogging there, which you can see by the intermittent spray pattern. You see, I'm not pulling very far back on the trigger. I've not been pulling very far back on the trigger, and I've not been getting great coverage. And indeed, I keep having to rock the trigger a little bit in order to free up the paint and actually have it go through. As you can see, it's not really flowing through the airbrush very nicely. If I add a couple of drops of thinner to that though, give it the old stir-roo. You can see the same test. It's running down the side of the cup nicely. There we go. And that's flowing much better now. Again, though, because I've thinned it, it is going to be prone to spidering, so you've got to keep an eye out for that. But it is flowing through much better. Don't do that. Now, if you see this pattern, it's known as spidering for some reason. Probably because it looks a little bit like a spider, although it's got way too many legs. This is caused by a few different things. Number one, you have sprayed too much paint into a single area, and the air is then pushing that paint out from that central blob. Number two, your paint is too thin, and therefore isn't drying fast enough on the surface, so that, again, the air is pushing it out into that shape. Number three, your air pressure is too high or you are too close to your surface. Either, doesn't really matter which one. And again, the paint is not dry and the air is pushing it out. Either way, your paint is not dry. And the air is going, hey, just moving it all around. We don't want that. That's spidering. That's a very, very common occurrence. It's, very easy to reproduce. Like that. Just hold your airbrush too close, you'll get spidering. So you want to bring your airbrush back. No spidering. Same paint, just different amount of trigger control and different amount of distance. Some final things to look out for that you might notice. If your paint is drying with a kind of rough grainy finish, then that means the paint is drying before it hits the model, which means that you're spraying from too far back, or your pressure is too low. If your paint is running, it means that you're applying too much of it. If it's got a kind of an orange peel effect, then it actually means you're applying too little of it. Ultimately, all of the paint will usually run together and form a cohesive kind of flat layer once it dries. So if it looks like it's beading up a little bit, just let it dry for a while and see how it goes. I hope this video was helpful. If you did like it, then click the like button. You can subscribe up there. Check out my Patreon where you can find more videos. YouTube thinks you like that. And thanks for watching. Bye.